Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we are going to talk about the 9.2 tier set bonuses. This includes talking about the tier set bonus mechanics, going over how the tier set impacts our gameplay, and then reviewing how some of our character optimization decisions are affected as a result of the tier set bonuses. Note, I am talking about the tier set bonuses under the assumption that all of the current bugs successfully get fixed and that no additional tuning occurs. In particular, this video script was put together on February 14th, so it is not accounting for any changes that may have happened after that date. First, we'll discuss how the tier set bonuses work, starting with the two-piece bonus. The two-piece tier set bonus includes two separate effects. First, Hard Strike gives you a 1% stacking strength buff whenever you Hard Strike with Dancing Rune Weapon active. Second, Hard Strike gives you 0.5 seconds of additional Dancing Rune Weapon duration when used while Dancing Rune Weapon is active. Furthermore, the stacking strength buff persists for 10 seconds after Dancing Rune Weapon expires. This bonus isn't too impactful on its own, especially if you aren't using the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary, but things get more interesting when the 4-piece tier set bonus is added on. The first portion of the 4-piece tier set bonus is that it gives us the ability to trigger a hard strike whenever we take damage at a rate equal to our parry rate. An important piece of information here is that the triggered hard strike has a 3-second internal cooldown, and, for all intents and purposes, this hard strike does everything a normal hard strike does. As a relatively normal hard strike, these counterattacks interact with the two-piece tier set bonus. They can apply Death's Due stacks when we are Night Fae, and they can spread Shackle the Unworthy when we are Kyrian. If the heart strikes trigger off of damage from a living enemy that is not in front of you and in melee range, you will gain 15 runic power and the effect will go on cooldown. However, you will not heart strike in this situation, since the game tries to heart strike an unattackable target. Now, if the effect procs off of damage from the environment or a dead enemy, the game will attempt to heart strike your current target. And if your current target is not a valid target for Heart Strike, this is another situation where you won't trigger a Heart Strike and will instead only gain 15 runic power. Also, a few types of damage don't trigger this effect, such as AoE damage and some sources of friendly fire. For the second part of the 4-piece tier set bonus, our Dancing Rune Weapon ability can now summon a second weapon. Keep in mind that this second weapon does not in any way affect our normal 40% parry buff that you receive when Dancing Rune Weapon is active. However, it does double the bonus damage output of your Dancing Rune Weapon minions, as well as doubling the bonus resource regeneration we get from Dancing Rune Weapon when using Heart Strike or Marrowrend. So, the copied abilities now gain 67% extra damage instead of 33% extra damage. Hard Strike now generates an extra 10 runic power instead of the usual extra 5 runic power, and Marrowrend generates an additional plus 6 bone shield stacks instead of the normal bonus of an additional 3 bone shield stacks. Altogether, the tier set gives us a strength multiplier, more Dancing Rune Weapon uptime, more Dancing Rune Weapon damage, more Dancing Rune Weapon resource regeneration, and more hard strikes. But what's more interesting than the bonuses themselves are the implications that they have on the rest of the specialization, and that is going to be the subject of focus for the rest of the video. We'll start by looking at gameplay implications specifically. The first gameplay implication is with Death and Decay usage, which is a topic I've covered in a previous video before the tier set bonus existed. However, some of the guidance I provided in that video will now be different, because the extra heart strikes from the tier set bonus means that we gain more heart strike cleave per cast of Death and Decay, at least if we are fighting 3 or more targets. This means that the value of our individual Death and Decay casts goes up. Additionally, the extra runic power generation from these heart strikes further puts us into a situation where we have excess resources that we don't have the cast time to use in some situations. so saving runes on Death and Decay casts with Crimson Scourge procs now becomes less valuable, because the extra heart strikes we would gain start to come at the cost of Blood Boil or Death Strike casts. So, depending on your build and the situation, the tier set bonus can change our normal Death and Decay priorities due to these effects. In 9.1.5, our normal rotation has us casting Death and Decay only if we have a Crimson Scourge proc. The only exceptions to this being if we were Night Fae, since Death and Decay is much more powerful as Night Fae, or if we are fighting 3 or more enemies while using Heartbreaker and the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary. The Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary generates a lot of extra runes, so it allows us to fit extra heart strikes into each Death and Decay, in addition to the fact that we don't have enough cast time on multiple targets to use all of the extra resource regeneration. In 9.2, we have a new exception where, even without the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary, it can be worth using Death and Decay on 3 or more targets with the Heartbreaker talent active, as long as we also have the tier set bonus. So, as long as you meet any of these conditions, you can benefit from more damage with only a minimal cost to your mitigation by aggressively using Death and Decay. The next gameplay implication I want to touch on is Marrowrend usage during Dancing Rune Weapon, which is also a topic I've covered in a previous video on Bone Shield management, without considering the tier set bonus. In 9.1.5, our Marrowrens during Dancing Rune Weapon would generate 6 total Bone Shield charges, while our Heart Strikes would generate 20 runic power, up to a maximum of 30 runic power if we include Heartbreaker generation on up to 5 targets. The tier set bonus increases these numbers to a total of 9 Bone Shield charges on Marrowrend, and both runic power values are increased by 5 runic power. So, one valid question we could ask ourselves is if this changes Marrowren priorities at all, because in order to gain full Bone Shield generation from Marrowrens during Dancing Rune Weapon with the tier set bonus, we would need to lose our Ossuary bonus for an extended period of time, leading to a loss of runic power generation. For a quick reminder, Ossuary reduces the cost of Death Strike by 5 runic power, whenever we are at 5 or more stacks of Bone Shield, so we lose runic power whenever we Death Strike outside of this Bone Shield range. Before, we'd be more than happy to Morrowrend on 5 Bone Shield stacks or immediately after hitting 6 Bone Shield stacks during Dancing Rune Weapon, where we'd only lose either a very small amount of Ossuary uptime or a very small amount of Bone Shield generation. Now, oddly enough, we're likely doing the exact same thing. It's looking like our damage and Death Strike output are not very affected no matter how we Morrowrend, though in Simcraft it's looking more likely for you to see minor losses when you are losing Ossuary uptime versus losing Bone Shield stack generation. That, in addition to the fact that Ossuary indirectly increases our runic power pooling, there isn't much of a reason to maximize our Bone Shield generation if it means losing Ossuary. Even though nothing changes here, I thought it was worth a mention since it isn't very obvious. Going into all of this, I personally thought that there is potential that we would want to Morrowrend less as a result of the tier set bonus before investigating things in more detail. The final gameplay consideration I want to go over is runic power pooling, which is a topic I've previously talked about in my Death Strike video. As for why we are talking about it, the 4-piece tier set bonus heart strikes generate full runic power, but they are sporadic and mostly unpredictable. So, when we decide to manually cast a heart strike, a tier set counter-attack heart strike can also occur in the same global cooldown before we have the opportunity to dump our runic power into a death strike. Furthermore, the second Dancing Rune Weapon increases the runic power generation of both of these hard strikes by an additional 5 runic power. And, if that wasn't enough, the Night Fae Legendary amplifies our runic power generation when we are standing in Death and Decay by 20%. So, we have much higher burst runic power generation potential with all of these changes. And, at least with current tuning, Night Fae is looking like a very powerful Covenant choice, so this legendary effect is potentially very relevant. However, as a result of all of this extra runic power generation, we have more resources than we are capable of using, especially against multiple targets. So, while lost runic power does reduce the number of death strikes we can perform, it will indirectly increase the amount of heart strikes or blood boils we can perform otherwise. So, the runic power overcap losses shouldn't be as painful in 9.2 as they normally are in existing content. Because of everything going on here, this could only be investigated once Simcraft was updated with the tier set bonuses. Originally, I had recommended an all-purpose threshold of 105 runic power to determine when you want to death strike to avoid overcapping runic power. This allowed for a healthy amount of runic power pooling with only a small amount of runic power waste if performed properly. Now, the 105 runic power pooling number is still in play most of the time, but I'm stressing a threshold of 85 runic power when Dancing Rune Weapon is active. Let me explain what's going on here. The first interesting thing that became apparent when I started analyzing priorities with the tier set bonus is that higher runic power thresholds appear to result in higher overall profile damage when more than one target was specified. This is expected to some extent, since Heartstrike and Blood Boil do more overall damage than Deathstrike outside of single target encounters. But what surprised me is that, even with a runic power threshold for Deathstrike as high as 120, which is the highest I tested, I was still seeing DPS increases even in a Simcraft profile that had no need to Deathstrike for survivability reasons. So, as long as you aren't being overly neglectful of Deathstrike, a decent amount of runic power losses result in more damage output, and our overall survivability shouldn't be a concern either, since we'll have a larger runic power pool when we actually start taking damage. In fact, if you really wanted to, you could use higher runic power thresholds than the values I have listed here when fighting multiple targets if you don't mind the extra work. As a result, our main concern with runic power losses have more to do with single target encounters, where Deathstrike does substantially more damage than Blood Boil or Heartstrike, and our runic power generation is a lot more limited. Because Dancing Rune Weapon now increases our Heartstrike runic power generation by 10 with the tier set bonus, in addition to the possibility of counterattack Heartstrikes, there is a lot more value to be gained by changing the threshold specifically for when Dancing Rune Weapon is active. So, despite the small amount of added complexity, I believe it's worth tracking Dancing Rune Weapon now if you can. Otherwise, you'd be looking to use a threshold slightly lower than 105 in order to get similar performance out of a single threshold setup. With the gameplay implications out of the way, let us take a look at how some of our character optimization choices are going to be affected by the tier set bonuses. To start, we have a couple of talent rows that are likely to be affected by the tier set bonus. The first of which is the choice between Heartbreaker and Blood Drinker. As things stand now, Blood Drinker is mostly used for a single target damage option in Raid, while Heartbreaker is used in Mythic Plus if you need a more mitigation focused build in Raid, or on Raid encounters that have a lot of cleave opportunities. With the tier set, the extra heart strikes you'll be getting means that Heartbreaker will be generating more runic power than usual even on single targets, which means Heartbreaker now adds more mitigation and damage output than it has done previously. As such, this trade-off is going to lean a little more towards Heartbreaker next patch, and it wouldn't be too surprising to see more Heartbreaker usage even in single-target raid encounters, especially if we end up using Night Fae, since Blood Drinker makes the Night Fae rotation a little more complicated. However, we don't have too many methods of increasing our damage in raid, so if the increased complexity isn't an issue, I still believe that we'll be seeing a decent amount of Blood Drinker usage overall. As for Relish in Blood, Blood Tap, and Foul Bulwark, right now, Relish in Blood and Blood Tap are somewhat competitive options in Raid. Blood Tap is the stronger Mythic Plus talent, and Foul Bulwark sees some usage on the higher end of Mythic Plus, though it's an uncommon pick as of right now. With the tier set changing the way we use Death and Decay, we're less likely to want to wait on Crimson Scourge procs when using Heartbreaker, so Relish in Blood becomes a little less appealing overall, especially when you consider how strong Night Fae is looking right now, though that isn't directly related to the tier set bonus itself. However, the more interesting consequence of the tier set bonus is that it's an indirect buff to Foul Bulwark. Both Blood Tap and Relish in Blood have less relative impact to our overall resource generation with the tier set, along with the fact that resource bloat from the tier set makes both Blood Tap and Relish in Blood a lot weaker than they normally are. As such, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more Foul Bulwark and higher Mythic Plus content this season compared to last, and I'd be willing to bet things turn out that way. Finally, we have Voracious versus Bloodworms, where the extra runic power generation associated with the tier set bonus further boosts the mitigation effectiveness of Voracious relative to Bloodworms, while the extra heart strikes also lower the relative damage contribution of Bloodworms. Currently, Bloodworms is a damage flex option in Raid when encounters aren't very threatening to the tank. While Bloodworm's role isn't changing, the trade-offs involved become more unfavorable to Bloodworms, so a shift away from Bloodworm usage wouldn't be too surprising. As for our legendaries, the main impact of the tier set is that Crimson Rune Weapon has a stronger matchup against Super Strain due to all of the extra benefits being granted to Dancing Rune Weapon by the tier set bonus. Crimson Rune Weapon was already an extremely strong legendary in Mythic Plus content, but this change could open the door to seeing it more in Raid, where it currently isn't used very often because Raid bosses don't melee us very often at all. Because of how dependent Crimson Rune Weapon and the tier set bonus are on being melee attacked by enemies, it's hard to make too many sweeping raid recommendations, but early Simcraft data shows that it's doing competitive damage with Super Strain against a traditional raid boss profile. So, there's a good chance that it will be better than Super Strain when you consider the extra non-damage benefits of Crimson Rune Weapon. But there could be some specific raid encounters where this isn't the case, so we'll just have to wait and see a little bit on this one. While there are a number of other legendaries that disproportionately benefit from the tier set bonus beyond Crimson Rune Weapon, it really isn't looking like anything new suddenly becomes competitive that wasn't already competitive before, so I wouldn't worry too much about the other options at this time. Moving on to covenants, the tier set doesn't apply equally to all of them, and this is mostly because the extra heart strikes are worth more for some covenants in particular. One example of this are the Night Fae, who benefit from higher Death Stew stack generation, so it will take less time to reach max Death Stew stacks, and it will be a lot easier to prevent the stacks from expiring. Additionally, Night Fae benefits from a near-permanent 20% strength buff in 9.2 once you take their legendary effect into account, which is a damage benefit the other covenants do not have. So, Night Fae will disproportionately gain more damage from the tier set compared to other covenants. Finally, Night Fae will generate more runic power from the tier set Heart Strikes because of their legendary. So, in addition to more damage, they'll gain disproportionately more runic power from the tier set as well. The second example of disproportional benefits are the Kyrians, who are able to spread Shackle the Unworthy faster with the extra Heart Strikes. This results in higher damage in multiple target scenarios, and potentially more rune regeneration from the Kyrian legendary effect. And because Kyrians gain a significant damage buff in multi-target pulls from Shackle the Unworthy with their legendary bonus, Kyrians will deal relatively more damage with their heart strikes in these situations, at least compared to Necrolords and Venthyr. The last optimization change we'll need to consider is the effect of the tier set bonus on gearing. The proc rate for the tier set hard strikes is based on our parry rate, and one way of increasing our parry rate is by increasing our critical strike rating. So, more critical strike rating increases the amount of hard strikes we gain from the tier set. Granted, we can't proc a heart strike off of a parried attack themselves, so there are diminishing returns on this as shown below. But we're unlikely to ever get to the point where more critical strike lowers our overall effective proc rate, which would be around 50% on melee attacks before accounting for a few minor factors like enemy level and our dancing rune weapon uptime. Not shockingly, the main result of this interaction is that critical strike will become relatively more valuable compared to its value without the tier set bonus, by providing more tier set heart strikes. Granted, the increase in value of critical strike is heavily dependent on how often you are taking damage, so just keep that in mind when we are talking about gearing in this section. There are also some effects to non-critical strike stat values due to the tier set bonus, but these effects are relatively smaller and don't really result in any interesting implications. Alright, so what implications does this higher relative value of critical strike have for gearing? Well, without the tier set bonus, critical strike provided the most damage by a very small margin. But that came at the cost of a noticeably worse mitigation contribution than other secondary stats, especially in multi-target situations. With the tier set bonuses, critical strike's damage advantage over other secondary stats has the potential to be a lot more significant, as long as we are taking damage and the mitigation loss, while still significant, is noticeably less in all scenarios. Granted, I have to re-emphasize that these changes are very dependent on taking damage to proc the 4-piece tier set bonus effect. As for what this means for actual gearing, Critical Strike was generally our worst overall stat for both Raid and Mythic Plus in current content. In fact, it's so bad in multiple target situations that, in Mythic Plus specifically, you can justify using items at least 7 item levels lower in just about any slot just to avoid having Critical Strike on your gear. But things change with the tier set bonus. Once we get the tier set bonuses, Critical Strike is likely not the worst stat in Raid, and it could even be something we specifically target in certain situations. Critical Strike's exact performance in Raid has a lot of uncertainty at this time, since, again, it is very dependent on how frequently you are taking damage to potentially proc the tier set effect. But I wouldn't be surprised if versatility and Critical Strike builds become a good thing to shoot for in Raid because of the tier set bonus. So, keep that in mind. For Mythic Plus, Critical Strike still isn't a very desirable stat, but it isn't bad to the point where we are dropping item levels because of it, at least not for most item slots. Jewelry is always a unique case because almost their entire item budget is secondary stats, and the secondary stat budget doesn't increase too much with item level increases. As such, even small differences in secondary stat value can help to justify using lower item levels in these slots, depending on the options that are available to you. In conclusion, we have reviewed the mechanics associated with the tier set bonuses, we've talked about how the tier set bonuses are going to affect our gameplay, and we have discussed how the tier set bonuses could influence our optimization decision making. If you would like to make it easier for other Blood Death Knights to find this content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there are any additional topics you would like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about the tier set bonuses, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.